So did Jesus overrule Moses? In Matthew 19, Jesus says, "You have heard it said," a typical Jesus saying that points back to the law, that is, the law in the letter, Torah, the law of Moses. And here it's in reference to the commandment in Deuteronomy 24 that whoever becomes displeasing to him, that is, the husband, can be divorced. "But I say to you," says Jesus, "if your spouse has not committed some terrible sexual sin, you must not divorce and marry someone else. If you do, you're being unfaithful." So here we find yet another Torah observant test by the Pharisees. In Mark 10, verse 5, Jesus adds that Moses wrote and gave you this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. So this is a reference back to Moses as the agent of the God of Israel, Yahweh, because as we know from the passages in Exodus 4 and 7, Yahweh made Moses a God or God to Pharaoh and Aaron his prophet. This is why Moses can even speak in the first person as Yahweh, the God of Israel himself, in Deuteronomy 29 to the people of Israel. So in this overturning of Moses, clearly Jesus is preferential to women as well, so that the Moses commandment as originally written and told to obey was preferential to the husband than to the wife, since he could at any time, according to the commandment, put her aside or do away with her in order to marry someone else. So Jesus expressly does not copy Moses here. He's clearly overturning the original commandment under the letter of the law. Jesus supersedes Moses by changing and tightening that old law. Ellicott's commentary says, he agreed, as we have seen, with the ideal of marriage maintained by the followers of Shammai. He accepted as a legitimate interpretation of the law that of the followers of Hillel, but he proclaimed, with an authority greater than that of Moses, that his legislation on this point was a step backwards when compared with the primary law of nature, which had been from the beginning. An argument can also be made that this situation was prophesied. In Siegel's book, The Halakha of Jesus, he writes that Jesus stands with Malachi when he uses the same verses from Malachi chapter 2, who refers back to the event of creation in Malachi 2, verse 10, and roots his attack on both mixed marriage and divorce in the original design of God. In Malachi 2:15, he refers to the single being that God created, an allusion to Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, and reaches a climax with the line, "For I hate divorce." Of note is also the fact that Jesus here is redefining what adultery is. In the same book, Siegel says that adultery is usually only defined as a sexual act with a married woman. See Deuteronomy 22 and Leviticus 18. Thus, Jesus is elevating, expanding adultery to include sexual relations of any married man with a woman not his wife, whether or not she's anyone else's wife. So in Matthew 19, Jesus changes the law in the letter, the Torah, but it doesn't mean he destroys it. As he says in Matthew 5:17, he came to fulfill the law, not do away with the law. So that now we're under the law of Jesus and not the law of Moses. So he goes back to God's original law in a more radical way, similar to what Malachi was talking about. So Moses' certificate of divorce was a temporary provision in Deuteronomy 24. So yes, Jesus overruled Mosaic law in this instance. Again, Jesus' teaching actually renders the divorce certificate of the law of Moses null and void. As an addition to this, the issue of remarriage, in Matthew 19, verse 9, Jesus says, "But I say that if your spouse has not committed a grave sexual sin, you must not divorce and marry someone else. If you do, you are unfaithful." So obviously, divorce is allowed, but only within the scope of this teaching. If there is a valid reason for divorce under this new teaching, the law of Jesus and not Moses, then of course you can divorce your spouse, meaning that you're now single and free to remarry. That's clear from the text. But if done for the wrong reasons, Jesus says, then you're being unfaithful to your spouse. And of course, if you do remarry, it should be within the faith. We know Paul later calls this being unequally yoked, something he strongly advises against.